Let's start, I guess. Welcome, everyone. This is one person. it's good. It keeps me focused on both sides. Yeah, I understand. It's just it's a big distance. It's all good. Good to see you. It's a pity we're not having a few more people because today is going to be quite fun. But that's okay. You're here and that's what's important. So thank you for joining today. So this is number 6 of a journey of 7 talks. Next week will be the last one in the series. And I want to mention it now because I think it will be announced that it's going to start earlier next week. I think the plan is 3 o'clock. Am I right? So this I'll mention it again later. And in the next session, I want to show off a little bit what has been happening at the House of Arts in terms of the collective project that's been happening with some of the students as well as some of the artists. And I will be taking us on a journey of how the studio is everywhere, a little bit like you've been part of a studio every time we've had a lecture, you've also been part of it. So we'll do a reflection on that process as well next week. So it's a nice way to round it off as well as showing some examples. But today's journey is about looking at inventing an ecosystem and looking at art and agency. Now I'm touching on a few things I've touched on before in some of the previous talks, but the big concept around today is the question of an ecosystem and the question of how do we as artists create worlds around us that start to make sense for economic purposes, for survival purposes, but also for inspiration purposes. And I'll take us through the journey of making an ecosystem happen. But before that, I want to share with you what you did last week and how I've layered it onto the work. So if you remember these wonderful sounds that some of you don't like, as well as the drawings that we did in the second session, the maps of the images of the territories in the third session. The worlds you created in the world making with the little figures and a piece of paper looking at encounters of another kind, spaces we create around ourselves, and the question of the unknown and our relation to that which we like or don't like. Then I was wondering, how do I incorporate what we did last week into this video? And I decided I cannot just layer it on top again. I have to do something. So what's very beautiful for me is how you all created these backdrops, these maps of concepts that juxtaposed each other like the exquisite corpse that they were, and then these flags that represented something on the journey that sits in the foreground, creating a new layer. So I was very inspired to look through this material and actually studied a little bit and try to make connections between the different elements. So thank you. It's a really nice thing to start seeing it come together, and I'm starting to read our feedback from the lectures in a very interesting way. So some people have answered me directly and written me notes, but others have been kind of expressive mark making that I really enjoy going through afterwards, and I spend quite a lot of time looking at it. So in true participatory style, today we're going to do another little exercise, but this one has got 2 sides. One side that will be public, and the other one that will be completely private. So one side that's just for you, and the other side that will be for all of us. So the tradition of mind mapping and creating personal journeys is one that I obsess about, and I'll show you some examples in a second. But what I'd like you to do is use the sheet of paper that you've got, with whatever color you've chosen, and as we're going through the talking of ecosystems, and I'll explain to you just now the value chain and the journeys, I want you to start making your own mind map, where you put yourself somewhere, connect yourself to something else, to something else, to something else, to something else, and end up making a little mind map of your own, where as things come up that are personal to you, that's what I'm saying, this is the private side. This is the side that is just for yourself to reflect on. These are your notes. You're not going to give them to me at the end of the session. You're going to just show me what's on the other side at the end of the session. So these are your notes of what you want to hold on to in the talk, and the mind map that you will create. As I said, I'll show you something in a second. And then towards the end of the session, we're going to turn it around, and you're going to put a few key elements on this side, which is what you're going to share with me. And just for the fun of it, because we're a creative space, we're going to then have a bit of fun, and we're going to make them into little moments like that. And that's how I'm going to photograph you in the class afterwards, showing me the public face and keeping the private face to yourself. A little bit of fun for me. Because I'm always looking at you and I want to have it work the other way around too. So, very simple task. Use that side as you like to make your own mind map in your notes, and I'll show you some examples in a second. And then we'll get to the other half later. I'll keep this one. It's mine. All right. So as I said, one side is a mind map of yourself, your private image, and the other side is the public network or the public image. So in the usual tradition of the slide journey, my notes today, I want to talk about the artists positioning themselves in the agency that comes with how you position yourself, especially on something which we call the value chain, which I spoke about in the very first lecture, which we'll never remember at this point, but I'll explain it a little bit more, and how it works within the cultural industry to make it an effective link and understanding of how we position ourselves within a strategic relationship to others, how we self-organize, and how we manipulate systems in order to achieve that which we want. How can we place ourselves within the industry in a clever way? And as artists working in our industry, how do we link to other industries? Now, I've spoken a lot about that already in the art and science collaborations, so it'll be more about playful ideas of other research areas and the idea of creating your own ecosystem. How do we create our own audiences? How do we play with other knowledge systems to develop our own spaces? And how do we build relevant networks? The most important part of what it means to survive as an artist. And then something that I'm quite excited about that comes up more and more in contemporary, especially European Union discussion around the creative industries is future market connectors. How do we connect to possibilities of the future? We're all young, creative people that want to have an impact in life somehow. How do we get there? What do we do to connect to other market industries, and how can we think about the future for ourselves as artists? So if one talks about an ecosystem, I'll read that for you because it's very small. This idea of creating an ecosystem, illustration that was generated by a community of practitioners in South Africa under the Trinity session, where we were mapping different ways of working. There's the one kind of definition of an ecosystem, which is an area, mainly geographical, where plants, animals, and other organisms that are affected by weather and landscape, they work together to form the bubble of life. Very simple biological concept. We exist because of this bubble of life. That's why the ecosystem that sustains a world exists. That could be in a small geographical space or in the larger global context. If we apply the same thinking to the creative industries and the cultural sector, we can say that an ecosystem features the relationships, be complex or easy or simple, amongst different organizations, communities, artists, businesses, cultural practitioners, cultural policies, and different types of elements that influence the cycle, production, and consumption of arts and culture. Again, very simple concept of what an ecosystem for the cultural industry could be. What's really interesting, if you think about it that way, all of us have got ecosystems around us in nature. We're surrounded by it. We can go into our garden and discover a little ecosystem. But if we start analyzing our ecosystems around us in this way, and we start mapping out what's around us and how we are in the center of an ecosystem, we start to think very differently around our relationship to others, just like, I guess, a little plant would think about how it's growing in a pot versus how it's growing under a tree in a forest versus how it might be growing and then being cut off to be sold as a flower. You know, what is it? Where do we exist in the ecosystem, and how do we feed the system in a valuable way? These are some studies that have been done with a group of artists in natural environments, trying to understand the natural environment through shadow play. So like a sheet being held up in the shadow of the torch, just trying to understand the space of the ecosystem and where we are as humans inside it. Note, there are no humans in this one. So, and understanding the ecosystem or the space that we're in, we need to look at something called, I find valuable, called the value chain. So Charles Landry, who's an urbanist, many years ago actually developed this idea of the cultural industry as having a value chain, a chain of a cycle of life that makes for a successful industry in the arts and crafts industries. So you've got something called the beginnings, which is the creators, the curators, the artists, the producers, the institutions, the things that start the process of making. You've then got the production space, which are the tools, the materials, the people that support you, the place that hosts you, those kind of things that allow for the conditions to happen for production. Then you've got circulation. Once the work is produced, you've got agents, media, curators, publishers, museums, etc., that start to circulate the work. They pass it on, they present it, they make arguments for you to be present. They create kind of ways of negotiating new spaces for the arts to be shown. You've got the delivery mechanism, which the circulation feeds into, which are the festivals, the exhibitions, the online platforms, again, the publications. In this, first was the publishers, now it's the publications. The kind of spaces that actually present the medium to you. The lectures, these kind of places where something gets exchanged and presented. But then comes some very important part that leads you back to the beginning, which is the audience reception and feedback. It's, on the one hand, it's the critics and the media, the workshops and the symposiums, where you can have feedback and you have dialogue. But very often it's also the stuff that you don't know, that you can't hold on to. It's the feedback that you get maybe through strange masks or through some kind of way of interaction that you don't expect. And that leads back to beginnings. It influences the creators again. It influences the curators and the institutions again. So that cycle, that value is a very, very important cycle. And as you can see, like with Swiss cheese, I put little gaps into it because as Charles Landry looks at this value chain and says this, if you have a continuous value chain, you can actually make sure that the industry works for you. There are always gaps. And what gets really interesting is if you think about your own value chain and your own surrounding, and you start looking where the gaps are in your own space, in your own industry that you're in. So as an artist, where do I see the gaps of my chain? So, I might be great up to this point of production, but then the big gap is how do I circulate my work? Or I look at the industry around me and I say, hey, it's actually all working and I just have to drop myself in the right place. And so we can start playing very strategically with how do we make art that can actually fill some of the gaps. And now that gets really exciting because who says we need other people to do this work for us? If you're a professional sports person, you've got your agent, you've got your trainer, you've got your masseuse, you've got your marketing person, you've got your finance person. Unfortunately, if you're an artist, you kind of do all of it yourself. So you start becoming a person of many trades, and you realize that's not really very wise because you don't always have the expertise to do it all. So you start relying on the gallery system, for example. You start relying on the curators to guide you, and the curators start relying on the institutions. And so you've got this kind of reliance system, which is on the one hand very good, but on the other hand sometimes creates major gaps in the value chain. And so in mapping that value chain, we've got different ways of mapping this. I'm going to just refer to my collaborator, Stephen Hobbs, and myself. We've got two very different ways of mapping. So like I said to you, create a mind map of your world. Everyone's got their own style. Stephen does this. He draws circles, lines, dots, connections, dates, words. I do that. I have words and sketches. I'm much more messy in that sense. Maybe his is easier to read, I'm not sure. But everyone's got their own style of mapping. And so when we come together, we often use his model more than mine because I can read his, he can't necessarily read mine. But it's a nice way of thinking through how do you use your own mark making to map where you are within the value chain or what aspects of the value chain you may want to make sense of. So over the years, we've done many of these. These are massive maps where you just start drawing and thinking. So you start with something that's important to you or a project or a relationship with a partner or I don't know, this for example was, I'm actually not sure what year this was, but it had different partners in it. So it, a science center, it has an arts factory, it's got a printing studio, it's got a museum. And so we just created a mind map of all the institutions we want to play with and work with. And we started to write, what is the relationship we have to these institutions? What is our role that we have? What can we offer? What can we take away? What can we challenge? And so making these mind maps is a way of creating the territory in which you want to work. to lay out all these possibilities that there might be. As I said, that these ways that I'm showing you here are very visible and almost become, for us, artworks. You know, they become layers that then get exhibited as drawings themselves. But actually what they are artworks to make sense of the art world. So they are drawings and maps that we use to map the territory, to map the value chain and say, okay, this is how it fits. And then sometimes they end up in museums. Sometimes they're very temporary, like little light drawings, as you see at the bottom. But the whole idea is that we keep on doing these lists and making these mind maps. And so these mind maps are not always written. This is an example of a mind map that is drawn. So yes, I've got keywords. So this is one of mine as an example versus Stephen's, where it's literally taking the journey, trying to make sense and explaining it to someone afterwards, where these ideas came from, what the links were, and what the connection is to whatever the theme or the concept was that we were mind mapping at the time. So thinking in mark, thinking in drawing, thinking in writing, and then having a dialogue of it afterwards. This video helps many years later when you're watching this and you listen to your own voice and go, oh, so that's what I was thinking about. So it's not always as clear, as interpretive as one would want. But what's nice about it for the moment, while you're doing that drawing, while you're doing the mapping, it really reminds you of the things that I guess you would have maybe lost if you'd not mind mapped it in that way. And so, yeah, as you can see, this is a multi-layered mind map book. I'm just going to skim through it with different ideas of different works. And so very different to the very structured linear mind maps. This is very much more an intuitive and playful way of taking notes. But you can see notes are part of it, text is part of it, and the list is always a good way to do it. So when I'm talking about making sense of the ecosystem, it doesn't mean that we have to be as scientific as we get prescribed to in our textbooks, but it's sometimes about being expressive and playful. And this is kind of what happens to these mind maps. They stand in my studio somewhere, and one day I'll look at them again. And then the nice thing is these mind maps become three-dimensional. So something that was once a large sheet becomes something that stands in a gallery, and the people that I worked with in creating a collective mind map suddenly can make sense of it. And so that already starts to link into a very important component in developing a network. So these mind map exercises like you're doing at the moment, if we extend them into a collective exercise, start to bring together people to build the network that will support you as an artist and share your vision. And so in terms of looking at the value chain, one of the most important components is how do you activate the people around you. So an example here would be the virtual space. We all know during the pandemic, sitting, looking at Zoom, trying to make sense of that person on the other side and sharing a pixel or sharing a corner or waving at each other was an important moment to connect. But what we didn't realize is that it was a really valuable tool, and I'm noticing now that this connection to others via the screen is actually one of those incredible social shifts that have happened. We think it's TikTok and all the rest, but actually there's a moment in this culture of sharing screens and doing collective exercises that has shifted something in terms of what the real virtual impact could be. So what was exciting for me, for example, to create a physical network, living in Vienna during the pandemic, not knowing many people in Vienna, and wanting to connect to South Africa, is asking collaborators in South Africa in different cities to do something at the same time in physical space, wearing the masks, social distance, but making a project using the symbols we developed collectively around human rights in virtual space, and actually in physical space in different cities in South Africa, make something. And that act of making something is a shared common space that is like a mind map across spaces, you know, a kind of across cities, across the virtual and the physical space. And then bringing it into Vienna, I then asked people in Vienna to share with me the symbols that were developed virtually, the things that people did at the same time in different parts in South Africa, and at the same time in Vienna, come collectively and make a presentation of those symbols. So it was purely an exercise of trying to connect questions of, in this case, this theme was about human rights and our future human rights and what it means. And these symbols were developed collectively around that, but it was about trying to create a network. This wasn't an artwork that is going to live beyond showing it once in a museum or in a gallery. You know, it's very pretty that it hangs there, it's very nice. But the magic of this moment was creating this collective community of conscious, connected people that during the pandemic did something physical. And because we did something physical, we were now sharing a common interest. And so that trick of getting to know your network and inviting your network to be part of your work is become really valuable. So yeah, different exercises to draw collectively, like we've done in the room, in making this little video together occasionally, becomes a fun part. But then for me also, there's the personal space in which I enjoy making my little works. So here is responding to a sound piece that a scientist and a curator made from the zone, which was about taking natural sounds and combining them with chess moves as a little audio piece. It was a very bizarre piece. And my mind map around what that could mean was drawing under microscope. So this is me under microscope drawing with a pen. And so it was really interesting that a tiny drawing like this started to embody a bigger concept. So this is just to show you the kind of process of playing and mark making without it being about necessarily writing down the facts, because I've got the sound piece that does that for me, and rather just allowing myself to respond to it. And it gets really exciting when one starts to mix the medium up a bit. So there's a lot of drawing, and then suddenly I realize if I put water on top of it, because there's some ducks or something that were represented, you know, the ink starts flowing, and the whole work starts changing. The visual journey starts changing, and there are new meanings created through the drawing and the sound. So how does this relate to the network? And it's in this collective play that it becomes really important. So the fact that we all made a sound together created an intangible network of exchange. What we haven't done yet is exchanged email addresses, or none of you have asked me for mine or anything to say, can I have a copy of that, please? The moment we do that, we start to extend the network into a personal connection where we start to be able to send each other messages and actually exchange that which we shared, and that is a common sound or a common game. So here, getting to know a group of scientists and artists at the same time, we just started to play games on a map. As you can see, there's some Scrabble in there, there's some other strange things, and the whole idea was just all to play together on the map and see what happens. And to this day, 3 years later, when we first played this game, we often refer back to the game and how the game could be part of that journey. But all of that is about building what we call the network neighborhood. Some of you might remember this wonderful icon from when there was still the low-tech version of what a network really means. And the idea of developing a network neighborhood is a very tangible way of saying, I'm plugging into you. I'm connecting one machine to the next, and I'm connecting a local area network that shares something. And that analogy or metaphor to technology is quite a fun one. So we established in the year 2001 a network neighborhood because in South Africa a lot of the galleries were closed down at the time. There was a complete crisis around the cultural industries, and we went to a theater that had a small space, and we said we would love to carry on a gallery here because they had no experimental spaces for students or young artists to show their work. A little bit like one would go here to any of the empty shops or anything like that and say, I want to actually use the space to activate it. And they offered us the storeroom, which was full of crap. And they said, yeah, if you want to use the storeroom, it's 100 square meters in the basement where the cars are parked. You can have that storeroom as an exhibition space free of charge. You have to just put on different shows. And so we took the opportunity, you know, still full of energy at the time and full of hair. And we said, okay, let's do something. And so in this little parking lot, we developed something called the premises, which was a space, a space, an area where we could show artists' works that weren't getting a chance to be seen in the few galleries and museums in South Africa or in Johannesburg that were there. And the big thing about this, and unfortunately because it was at the time where we didn't have a lot of these photographs, so there are very few photographs of the evidence, but on the door of this new gallery space, in gold letters, we put all of the future partners we wanted to work with one day. So LG Electronics is a technology company that we were hoping to get partnership from. We put the city of Johannesburg there. We put different people's names that we thought are really important in our network. And we just basically put a list of like 15 or 20 more, maybe 25 people that one day, or organizations that one day we want to work with, just because we thought, why not? They are future sponsors. If they're not our sponsors now, maybe one day they will be. And so, there we go. And on that door, we then had an opening event. We invited people, and we invited those people too. And they came and they saw this thing on the door, and they started to ask questions. And that very small trick turned this thing into a mega project. For 8 years, we had, a few years later, the basement was changed and they had to rebuild. And because of this network that we built up, they built us a brand new gallery, free of charge, this massive space that from this little underground space came. And when we go back and we think about this, the journey that we went on and the many exhibitions that followed, it all came back to that moment. And I think that's, for me, such an interesting thing, to think about the value of the network. How important is it to acknowledge that one day we will do something together without actually knowing that we're going to? It doesn't matter. It's the investment that you say in the trust of the relationship. And so what was exciting for us is that we got LG Electronics as a sponsor. It was amazing. They said, for your next show, we'll give you whatever tech you need. You know, easy. We had on there the city of Johannesburg as a partner. And what was interesting is quite a while later, we heard that apparently in the city discussion, when they were renovating that whole area and they were destroying what was going to be, what was our space, the CEO of the theater really motivated for us to stay there, because he said, look, they've got all these partners, they've got all this network, we need them to be part of our future cultural precinct. And so we created an importance and value of ourselves that didn't actually exist. We placed ourselves in the cultural industry, even though we knew that, you know, we were just an artist group trying to change something. And I think that self-involvement is a really, really important thing. And to acknowledge in that other people want to be part of your network. So not to say that you're so great, but to say that we all have something in common. The way we realize this is Stephen and I were invited to be part of a very important conference in Cape Town. And it's called the Design Indaba. It's where all the great designers come together, and artists and thinkers and architects, etc. And they said, don't you want to exhibit something in our foyer as a kind of concept? And we were really thinking, what could that be? How do we get the audience that comes to this conference to actually come to us and become our network? How do we make sure that that person who we know is important comes and joins us? And the one thing that I realized we all have in common is dead technology. We all somehow have some relationship to something that our parents heard or saw. We all have somewhere in a drawer a piece of technology that we have kept for some or other reason, the old phone, the old camera, the old toy that we had as a kid, whatever it is, or, you know, in this case, an old Bolex camera or a floppy disk. I don't know if any of you remember these disks. You know, these kind of relics of a past that someone once used. And so what we did is we gathered as much of our own dead media, because we unfortunately are collectors of dead media, and we created this big interconnected installation, and we put little labels onto all of the objects and wrote onto them, and then asked, as people walk past, they literally stopped and they say, hey, I've got one of these. Why is it so important? It's dead. Yeah, and so suddenly we created a talking point about the thing that we have in common, and that's a kind of nostalgia for a technology that is of the past, whether it's the phone that you turn with your fingers still, or whether it's the the old record player, which is coming back. You know, we know vinyl and everything is hip now, but, you know, a few years ago it was that thing that my parents were using. And so what was so exciting is people were coming back and imagining in the break of the conference what their relationship to the object was, and immediately we started to create a connection. Really? You have one of these too? Give me your number. I'd love to see a picture. Can you send me a picture? Oh, let's create this network. And so what we started to do is create something called the Museum of Dead Media. And this Museum of Dead Media doesn't have a building. It exists wherever the dead media is. So people could then submit as part of a publication wherever in the world they were, and share with us what their dead media is. So here, for example, this gentleman who lives in Potsdam in Germany, Mr. Engelbert, is a professor, and he owns all of these wonderful objects on his cupboard at home. So he sent us a picture of his objects, he told us what they're about, and we published him in our museum. So if you're going to Potsdam and you want to meet Mr. Engelbert because you like the look of this telephone, for example, and you want to go visit the museum, you are allowed to go and knock on his door and say, I'm here to see the Dead Media Museum, and he will let you in and show you his collection. Just like you might have something in your drawer at home that you want to share. And so what we did is we created a disconnected museum concept, not for the sake of creating a museum, but for the sake of building our network. Funnily enough, dear Mr. Engelbert invited Stephen eventually to come do a project in Potsdam at the university around his art program and his projects. So it's this connection that starts to really build that network that we need as artists. What are the strategic points? How can we manipulate the system to work for us? How can we use your nostalgia to benefit the dialogue that we need in order to feed our interests as artists into other worlds? And I think that is that playing with the ecosystem that is very important. Bringing it closer to here, maybe not that close, but anyway, it's in Austria, a small town called Murau, which is about 3,500 people in Styria in Austria, has got, as many other small towns have, this issue of people leaving the small town to go to the big cities. So it's this kind of question of people trying to make the money in the big cities, so they leave, and the small towns are suffering from a kind of motion of people leaving, and it's like people here going to Prague, you know, and having that relationship. There's always this strange tension between these spaces. So together with a group of artists in Murau, I created a project called Zurück, which means back, and then subsequently another project called Ein Haus, which is a way of playing with a house that's there. So Murau, as I said, it lies in a valley, a very beautiful part of the world, small town, has around it a culture, and this is again the connecting point of what they call Martel. Martel is these things that stand all over when you walk around the valleys and the nature, etc. And usually they stand in places where someone was killed or was lost. So there's this symbolic representation in the form of usually a Christ figure or something, but often painted or drawn into these symbols that say, this is a memory of someone that was here. Something happened in this moment. And so it's acknowledging something that is no longer here and is lost. So for the fun of it, we set up a whole bunch of martel across Murau in the small town. I think there were about 12 of them. And we set them all up all over the town. And we asked people to write onto the martel what they miss about the place. You know, is it the people that have left? Is it the markets? What is it that they miss? They should write and draw onto these martel. And it was amazing what people actually did end up writing on them. And we then made these collective artworks out of them, which became the martels that then stood. And the act of having people write on these martel and leave their little notes and then leave their little email addresses or the phone numbers. It's a small town, so everyone knows each other, and it's actually quite nice because you start recognizing that there is a sense of community. And we then brought people together in these little work sessions where we, just quickly show you what these martel end up looking like. Sorry. So these are just some close-ups. I just found this video on my hard drive. So this is them in black and white, standing at the moment, because this is when I saw them last. They were in the attic at the one house in Murau, and I just loved how scary it looked up there. But what they are, these very colorful drawings and notes, like you saw right in the beginning, of what people wrote or drew onto onto these structures that are all around. And so what was really exciting is that there were both abstract and very tangible and legible elements as part of it. And so we used these to then provoke little games that we wanted to play. And these games were getting people together to sit in circles and actually invent stories, called Das Spiel, the game, invent stories about this fictitious character that was living in Murau and wanted to leave and then come back. What does it mean to leave and come back? And what was so nice in terms of connecting people was how the story was invented. And using a dice and a little instruction, we created a very simple storyline. So you can see there's a playing field, and then the story developed as everyone rolled dice and started to tell a story. Now, collective storytelling is immediately something that generates a really exciting investment, because your part of the story creates part of a bigger narrative. And all it really is your mirror in terms of those things that mean something to you. And so what I was really excited about is that the people that started to be part of this continued to ask for the opportunity to meet again, to think about the future of this project that's called Zurück. You know, what is the connection of these large cities to these small places? And suddenly I realized as an artist, in the value chain, there was something about creating community without being an artist, but giving the voice to others. So I was fortunate enough that friends of mine bought this beautiful building and they were renovating it. But when we went inside, we saw memories of someone's life inside, wallpaper and all kinds of things. And what we did is we played the game of life, the Spiel des Lebens, inside this house. So I'm going to mute this slightly because it's actually quite loud and it's in the wrong language. But basically, everyone got little instructions and they got masks and they put them on and they were free to perform whatever they wanted. So it became a theater of experimentation. And in these different rooms, these theaters of experimentation was a way of trying to find out what is it that people are looking for in the memory of a place. What is it they are looking for in terms of the lives that they want to lead in the contexts of these small towns? What is important about the small town? What is important about the value of craft and art and all of these things to them? What does it mean to meet with their neighbors? What does it mean to gossip? And so these were really interesting, what does playing mean? You know, these were really interesting experiments that started to evolve into building a network of people. Why I'm showing you this is because I think the act of performing, the act of collective storytelling becomes a very important component to this journey. Just as a side note, because I showed the house, this is what the house looks like at the moment. It's completely, all the wallpaper's taken off and all these wonderful rooms and experiments have been changed. And I've started to put art by painting into the building. And the relevance of it is that Verwundbarkeit means vulnerability, is that I'm realizing that the community which I was interacting with really behind the masks and in the games exposed their own vulnerability. And this building is almost a metaphor for the vulnerability of the people that we're working with. And that vulnerability is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's the openness to be part of something once you give them the chance. And in thinking now as the role of an artist and what one can do in that is how can you give people the opportunity to, on the one hand, be part of your network? So how do you feature within creating your mind map and have others part of it? And how can the artist be part of visualizing something for the future? So there were 9 visualization studios that we did in South Africa. These studio workshops where via Zoom, because it was unfortunately during COVID, we had artists making art based on the interviews made with people that were talking about their future cities. And why I'm showing you this video is because you can get to see a few of the images that were being created as visual representations of these networks. So this is artists taking some of the keywords, taking some of the people's points live, cutting them out, making collages, writing, sculpting, quickly painting, while the interviews were happening in visualizing some of the points of envisaging future cities, problems with cities, their fears, in 3D models or in painted things and drawn things. And what was really interesting is the artists had to work very fast. You know, they had to respond to someone's conversation. So they made these works in incredible speed. And there were many artists involved. We organized kind of these teams. And the whole idea was, how do you help mind map through creative ways other people's ideas and make them your own? And so these multiple city experiences, there's just 4 of them, you can start seeing correlations and relationship between the different types of mind mapping that started to happen. So creating a little visual representation of the different urban ecosystems was really interesting. So these are just impressions of different ways that different artists were working with their mediums of choice in the virtual and physical space to create these journeys or these city representations. So we've got many of these examples, but it's about thinking, who am I in the global picture? How do I activate, how do I play, how do I explore, and how do I create the ecosystem around me, and then how do the others fit in? Sitting in my studio there is John Zip. He's a contemporary thinker who works with different economies. He's very much in the tech space and in the public technology space, like mobility and city making, and he's busy talking about his network while I'm mind mapping some of the conversations that were happening. And so what I realized in preparation for this lecture is that this is as much about mind mapping the cultural sector as it is about mind mapping his technology sector. And there's something quite nice about the fact that my poetic license to play actually allows my mind map to be applied both to what he's talking about and that which I want to talk about. So showing him this video afterwards, he then expressed that he used it actually in one of his presentations as a contemporary thinker in making sense of his network and his ecosystem that he's working on, while I'm experimenting with mine. And you can recognize the little figures that you guys were using a few weeks ago in your little mind maps that you were making. So what happens when you auto-draw while someone is speaking? What happens when you allow yourself to go free, a little bit like I'm asking you to do every lecture, that you draw while I'm talking, is you create sense for yourself, you play with something, but actually what you're doing is you're creating a mind map of a completely different kind. And that's why I've been enjoying going back to your mind maps, looking at them once you've given them to me to play with, and actually really allowing myself the time to internalize them and reinterpret them for myself, because I think that there's something unspoken about it. And while Charles Landry presents us with the value chain of a very structured thinking from the beginning to feedback, I think it's in these small spaces where we open up our minds to things that we least expect, where we open up our minds to marks and accidents that happen on the paper that suddenly provoke new metaphors that we can maybe fill the gaps in a completely new way. Maybe there are even gaps that we didn't know, which links to the future market connectors that we might find. In all of this, there's obviously the artist's aspiration. Now, I for a long time was struggling with this question of me as an artist with an ego. Who am I? I have to make it. I have to be big. I need my names and big lights. You know, this is always important for an artist. You know, how important can I be? And I realized a lot of these experiments are not about me, but about a process of understanding the context. And yet, there's this aspiration, this need to climb to the top. We're building blocks to get high so we can look down and say how great we are. And so I was struggling with this, and I was realizing how unstable this thinking is. And this is where the creative economy is so beautiful, because if you try to just be one needle in a big haystack, you'll always be that needle, and you might be great, but actually there's a whole world happening around you that you cannot access. And I actually made a little work in response to what a lot of the ecosystems that exist are about. So this little drawing, or collage, became this installation at one of the art fairs in Johannesburg. So Johannesburg got a big art fair. Oh, it's got several, but the most important one there, the gallery asked me if I'll show some work. So I think I've got one or two drawings of mine on the back wall there. But most importantly, I said I'd like to make a work about this notion of aspiration, this need to get somewhere, this idea that I want to stand out in an art fair. And art fairs are so impersonal. There's nothing worse than an art fair. You walk in and you see one work of yours and all the others work around, and you realize how insignificant the work is because no one asks why, how, what. It's not like you've got a show where you can control your audience. This is an audience that will go and say, that looks nice because it fits to my couch. And you as an artist go, ugh, that's the worst thing you could say. But that's the reality. So inside this art fair, people are trying to become the heroes. You know, they're trying to sell, but at the same time try to be important. And for me, this very strange tower of blocks was exactly this, the need that we have to get somewhere. And I find that's very important to identify that within the ecosystem, to say, are we in that place and how do we position ourselves? So coming back to one of my experimental videos in the studio, I took those very blocks a few years later and many more blocks that I'd collected over time because I made a few of these installations. And before throwing them away, I decided to make one more work out of them, which was exactly about the same topic. Sorry. That started in the wrong place. Or not. Yeah, it did. All right, you'll see a snippet of it, doesn't matter. So here, Wiseman and I are literally trying to think about making it to another space. What you don't see is the beginning part where we're busy hoisting the first line up. Unfortunately, that was cut off in the beginning of the film. But, you know, it's this idea that we are aspiring towards something that at the end of the day ends up just in a pile of rubbish at the end. You know, it's that pile that in the next film, which I'm not going to show you now, that pile, as you can see, ends up in a bin and eventually gets taken away to the dump and gets burnt. You know, it's this idea that, you know, all of these building blocks that we've got are insignificant moments unless we're actually building something with them, unless we're actually aspiring towards something else. And so this idea of the featured market connector is really, really important. How do we position ourselves in relation to the rest of the economy? How do we search, and how do we try to find these connections in other markets that we want to use? So this little thinking sketch was drawn in relation to a discussion with some EU partners that are currently talking about, you know, this idea that the EU needs to think about very strategic creativity and culture programs that connect gaming and visual arts, or mobility with performance, or, you know, like trying to see what are the distant relatives that need to come together to create new moments for market connectors. How do you, for example, as we all know it happens already, fuse nanotechnology with fashion? You know, what happens when you bring these distant things together and something else evolves out of that? Or biological programs with sculpture. Very obvious for us now, but there's a whole discussion around how do you actually create categories for these things, and how do you bring X and Y into this common space for a vision for the future? What are the future market connectors and how can we use them? Now, why I'm mentioning this here in this context is because right now, I believe personally that we're in a crisis moment. We're sitting in a moment of time where institutions are such big instruments that have been established. The galleries, the museums, the educational institutions, they've been designed to move straight down the channel to get us somewhere. But if something happens, there's no way of them turning back. They're too big as instruments to actually turn. And there was one image, which I should have actually put into this presentation, that recently in the Suez Canal, there was this image of the big tanker that got sidelined, and it was blocking the whole canal sideways. And for me, that was, a metaphor for this blockage that happens when you try to move the tanker. So we know we can't move the tanker yet. We're at this kind of crisis moment where the tanker is moving in one direction. But we can think about what happens on the tanker. How do we start deconstructing it? How do we start reimagining it? And what I'm really excited about is that within these discussions in the EU models, in the global museum models, in the institutions like here, there are critical questions. There are multidisciplinary studios. There are questions of crossover between art and science. There are these wonderful things. And we as artists need to take the lead of that. We actually need to stand back and say, okay, we see the institutions are trying, but how do we see ourselves featuring in this combination of very different worlds coming together? And so I'm quite excited about this prospect more and more that in the cultural economy, in the kind of arts and crafts sector, and the visual arts, the value chain model, part of this journey in filling these gaps is to reinvent every step of the way from beginnings to feedback and saying, well, we've got new industries and new industry partners that we really need to think about. But in that, we mustn't forget our own dreams. And this is something that always I get reminded of. It's very easy to kind of get sucked into this future thinking and connecting with other technologies and other industries and trying to be innovative. But we all have our own passions and dreams. And so what tricks can we do to remind ourselves of those passions and dreams and hold on to them and actually visualize them? So I want to show you Chasing Light because it's still something that I'm doing. I've always wanted to see that. My whole life I've been wanting to see that. Still haven't. The Aurora Borealis for me has always been this thing that, this is an amazing moment where space and Earth have some kind of a strange relationship with each other, and it's this incredible drawing in the sky. And I imagine if I ever see it, I can just cry right there. I don't know. We'll see what happens when I do see it. But why I brought this in as an example is that while it's very nice to talk about all this future market stuff, etc., it's very basic. I want a visceral experience. I want a physical, enlightened experience. I want to still be in that space of complete amazement and disbelief at what's happening around me. And I was invited once to Tromsø in the Arctic Circle for a project. I was so excited because this is perfect territory to see the Northern Lights. And it was at the right time of the year, and it was just all the conditions were apparently right, except that it was overcast the whole time I was there. So I went all the way up into Finland, and I tried to see the Northern Lights, and I just didn't get to see them. But apparently it was really, really active beyond that which I could see. And a friend of mine, James Webb, who's an artist that works a lot with sound, had a high-frequency recording device. It's like it's a device that just records electronics, airwaves and sounds. And he could pick up the frequency, and he actually gave me the sound. And earlier on in that video, that tick, 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 tick sound that you might have heard in that Mapping the Future connected mind map that I just did, that was the sound of the electronic rain, so to speak, of this that creates the Aurora Borealis, this frequency of the electromagnetism in the sky. And so I took that sound back to my studio, and I played it through a speaker that vibrated a surface with water on it. And I took a high-powered laser, I bounced it off, and I created my own Northern Lights. And so this is now in the studio, on the ceiling of my studio, and I had it. I didn't have the wow moment, but the logic side of me was, actually, I can create the dream in a small version in my studio for myself. There's something quite magical about doing that because I'm holding on to these sounds. I'm trying to see something that I didn't get a chance to see. Now remember, I'm in the southern tip of Africa, and I went all the way north to see something that I didn't see. I came all the way back, and I brought back this treasure. And what was interesting for me is that in making this, I realized that while I'm thinking about industry thinking all the time, I'm thinking about what the ecosystem is and where it is. This moment of having one's own dream, being mesmerized by it, and actually going into this experimental space where I'm trying to simulate it for myself is a really important thing. I've even taken it into planetariums and played it with it in the planetarium just to pretend like I'm in the Arctic Circle and being able to experience it. It's my way of playing with something that I know I haven't yet achieved, and one day I will, I hope. But it's this, it's holding on to that dream. It's trying to make tangible that which I know I haven't been able to do yet. And similarly, I think our role in building this network and coming back to this connecting to people isn't always about trying to just be strategic about, I want to know you because you can potentially support me and I can support you and we're going to do a project together, which is a very much that kind of thinking about the tower. Sometimes it's just acknowledging that we all have dreams, and sometimes it's about asking others to show you their dream and see what happens. So Stephen and I were lucky to be invited to go to Douala in Cameroon. And in Douala, there's a neighborhood on the border of the airport. There's an airport and there's a border community. And in that community, there are all these billboards that talk about flying to France. or flying overseas. And when you ask the people living there, is that their dream? They say yes, because they get told by the billboards that that's their dream. You know, there's this thing of, we're selling you the dream of somewhere else. The colonial story is about being somewhere else. And so we said, well, let's test the pressure of this dream. What happens if on that border that faces the airport, so this is the wall that faces the airport on the other side, what if we actually inflate the dream as a ball into it and project their dreams onto it? What happens if we actually do something like this? Literally build a space that people can reflect on and talk about what their dreams might be. And so the fun began in a lot of interviews and discussions around people's dreams, hopes and aspirations, where they're going. Oh, what's that? Okay. And so we started to think about how do you play with sketching people's ideas of what this dream could hold. I don't want it to flash like that. Come on. Yeah, so in the interview journey was one thing, but then just doing something as simple as inflating this little ball, well, big ball, into a space started to get people to ask questions. Well, if this is the world, how do we interact with it? What does it become? And it became really bizarre what was happening. This idea of projecting sound, image, concepts into that world. And what was very exciting in all the interview sessions, this ball became the activator. It became the thing that held people's dreams. It became the thing that started to represent that which we cannot necessarily make sense of. And when we then reflected on it with people, they really felt like it started to embody a certain physical presence, like the Northern Lights to me, of that which was so complex in understanding in the context of this very poor neighborhood with very, very complex colonial history and current crises. And it wasn't about talking about the crisis, it wasn't about trying to challenge the status quo, but it was just asking what dreams can hold and where they go. And so what we ended up with is the ball itself with a sound system inside where you could go and listen to people's dreams by putting your ear against the ball and listen to the stories and the narratives, and then watch some of those ideas and some of the people talking about it as a projection in the public space for a duration of time. And that sense of community and collectivity on this border to this airport, which talks about other people's dreams, became really important because we realized more and more as people were speaking about it, it was about a local understanding and a local dream, and no longer about this aspiration to go to the side where the grass is greener, but actually is trying to change one's own community. So people started to talk very differently about that and feel very differently about the interaction with others. And so in that ecosystem, why I wanted to show you this example is that it's got actually very little to do with me at the end. It's got to do with a story that someone else wants to tell about their own space. And it's my role to facilitate them finding their own voice for themselves. This project was only shown in Douala and nowhere else. And it wasn't, other than in this lecture, ever presented again as this kind of work. It was just something that was internal to the space. And then, I guess, looking at the last journey, so to speak, of the market connector journey, which I'd like to share with you, is to say, currently, we're sitting in this moment of study, which is so fascinating. So we've got the ecosystem of Earth, and then we've got the ecosystem of a space race that's going on again. This idea that we're going to build colonies on other parts of the world, of the universe, that we're going to go to the moon and occupy, we're going to go to Mars and occupy, we're going to be already occupying the space station. And so what are these new colonies that we're creating? What is the relationship that we're starting to form with a different kind of context? And so when we look at the future market connectors, we go, all right, there's billions being invested into the space industry. There's not enough money invested into the cultural sector. What if we brought the two together? What if we actually looked at what does culture and space look like? What does culture in another context look like? And my argument is that culture in space is as abstract to you as culture in Cameroon, or to someone in Cameroon as culture in Ustinatlabem. This is such a void of reality between the two spaces that we realize that looking into space and creating these journeys, such as, for example, here, I'm just going to jump ahead to part of this film, if I can. Yes, I can. So if we think about some of these journeys that we could go on, we posed the question to different artists and researchers: what is space? For example, in this question, we said, is space a research or resource? Is it public? Is it private? Is it, so we had different critical questions that we asked, and seeing that we're all in the periphery, what is our relationship to this? And we had performers from different parts of the world interacting with this performer from Cameroon, from Senegal, who's currently in Paris. So she's in Paris performing, responding to the participation of people answering that question in a certain way. So it was at a conference where we were trying to say, well, what is the emotional relationship to the subject? What are the performative questions that need to be answered? And how can we influence academics and thinkers and financiers to think differently about the emotional relationship of culture and humans in space, as opposed to just being about building space stations, sending more rockets, being Elon Musk to do the next thing? And what one starts to realize is, if there are different people around the world doing something at the same time, coming back to the previous example that I mentioned, to a live audience that asks themselves a critical question, it stimulates debate, it stimulates discussion, it stimulates an acknowledgement that more than you are thinking about something at the same time. And that connectedness was a really meaningful moment in thinking about what this idea of music moving beyond our planet, and acknowledging that we're all in the periphery in one form or another. We think that there's obviously the center and the periphery, and yes, in certain economies there are, but in other parts, like in the cultural space, we can really think about that we all have our perspective, and it comes back to this discussion of, or this presentation I had about the unknown and our perspective in relation to the unknown, is that in building this ecosystem, we have to acknowledge that we're all part of the same ecosystem. And if that's the case, then we're all in the periphery and in the center at the same time. And that is a radical shift. And this is what the space vision is teaching us. So this idea of acknowledging our relationship to space and the space industry is not just about a financial relationship to say they're making more money than us, or there's billions invested in space culture, we need to, or into space, we need to think about what space culture is, but it's about getting that perspective back and understanding that crossover into other disciplines. So Space Shelter Earth is something that's happening right now. It's in collaboration with Annick Bureau, who's a curator and the director of Leonardo Ollatz in Paris. And it's about saying, well, if we're going to design a space shelter, why are we getting scientists and experts to do this that think they know everything about the science? What happens if we design it from a completely different mindset? If we design it from something that is about acknowledging the ecosystem that we know we need to survive. And I'm not talking about the food and the water and the protective layer that we need to shield ourselves when we're in space. But what is the emotional connection? What is the psychological understanding? What is the sense of space in a completely different way of thinking about it? And so we've started to set up a series of studios and studio programs and workshops where we're collectively making and inviting people to join what it means to design a space shelter. And these have been ongoing and going for the next few years as different models that are following the large International Astronautical Congress, which happens in different parts of the world. It was in Paris last year where we did this performance. It's going to Milan next year. And this big congress is about NASA and SpaceX and all of these big superstars comparing their notes, while we come and talk about an underlying different interconnected community that needs to be part of this discussion without it being about who's building the next rocket, but actually thinking about what are the future connections as we as artists can play in this space. And they're looking at us as if we're crazy, obviously, but we know that it's within the space shelter question that we're going to acknowledge the fact that the best space shelter that you can live on is Earth. There is no better space shelter, and we're busy spending so much money investing into space when we should be equally spending the money and investing back into Earth. There's this kind of strange question of what science is doing for both spaces. And so while we are searching for this answer, we're inviting people to be part of that journey, and maybe in the next year, in the new year, we can have a Space Shelter Earth workshop here in Austin at Levem and think about what it means to position ourselves in relation to that space out there. So what I was hoping to do with this journey is to acknowledge the different parts of the ecosystem, our roles that we can play as individuals within filling the gaps, but now more importantly to zoom out and actually acknowledge Earth as an ecosystem in itself and how we can play with the whole ecosystem as a way as artists to hold it and actually say we represent it in one form or another. We talk about it. The show that's on, which I hope you're all going to come to, is opening tonight, Gardening of Soul at the House of Arts, talks about that moment too. It talks about this relationship to nature, to question of the natural environment, even if it's not nature per se, but the ecology and the human relation to our planet. And so much the language has changed in planning our business sector. The business sector now talks about an ecosystem. You know, it now reinvents itself based on the relationship to nature. And I think so the cultural industry is doing the same. And I think there's a really important connection between those. So while we were mind mapping and drawing and connecting and trying to make ourselves relevant and building towers, hopefully this mind map that we're creating for ourselves starts to pick on those things that are important to us and start to say something. And what I thought I would do for the last 2 minutes or so is play you a sound or a series of sounds that I've just cut together for the purpose of today, just using found material. And I'd like you to turn the page around, whatever notes you've taken, I don't care, that was for you. Turn the page around and select whatever you want to share with anyone else on the other side, and make your little mask in these last few minutes by just plotting a few of the words. If you want to share your private stuff, by all means, I'm not going to stop you. I just thought it's quite nice to have two sides, you know, the private and the public. But just for the sake of it, I'm going to do the same for myself. Let's take what we got from today's lecture, as well as some of your notes, and where you see yourself playing in this ecosystem of the world, and just use the time to reflect and make a few notes. You can draw them, you can write them, you can whisper into your paper, not do anything. It's up to you. But I'm just going to play a sound. Maybe not. I hope you realize that we could go on forever. I once made a mind map that I think I started at like 6 in the evening, and by 4 the next morning I had to stop because I was going crazy. I was like writing in tiny letters on a big wall, going, I need to put more information down, I mustn't lose this information. And it's a kind of a therapy that can go out of hand sometimes. So I think I'll stop it at this with the end of the sound, and we can maybe just share just by doing that with each other what our mind maps might look like. And if you don't mind, I'm going to take a portrait of each one of you with your mind maps on your face. Because I think it's a different way of... I'm not going to take them with me because your notes are on the other side. But if you don't mind, I'll go first with the selfie. If you want to share them with each other, you're more than welcome to. You ready? Why don't you all put your mind maps on your face? Let's see what happens. Fantastic. I'm going to look at them in more focus later on when I go back to the photographs. Does want to stay. Thank you.
I'm the only one with the white.
No. There was someone else with white as well. So if anybody wants to share any of your mind maps with others, by all means. If not, that's okay. Yes, I hope you actually take this mind mapping idea and play with it for yourselves in your own time. I'm sure you've got your own ways of making notes, but as I said, I become very obsessive about it, and it really helps making sense of the world. Usually I would start the session like this with art chairs and tables and a big sheet on the floor, and we all start writing at the same time. But I think we'll do that another time when we build the Space Shelter Earth here. But thank you. If there's any questions or comments, by all means, please do. In about half an hour at the House of Arts, there's a walk around with the artists about the exhibition that's happening. So the artists are all there, which is very exciting, and they'll talk about their work. You're more than welcome to join us. And then afterwards at 7, I think, is the opening. And we'll also show a video of some of the experiments we've been doing in the studio sessions with the other students. So come join us for a beer and a bit of fun at the House of Arts if you like. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.